And I'm really excited to see everybody, all the faces here to learn about salmon and Indigenous knowledge tonight. So I have been working in a salmon project with Nature Kids for the last few months, and I'm really honored. I'm living and learning here in Salmon Arm, which is in the unceded territory of the Secwepemc people. And I'm really honored to present tonight Bernice Jensen, who is a knowledge keeper in our area. She's a mother, a drummer, a dancer, and most of all, an educator for the last 20 to 30 or more years. She currently is the cultural education coordinator at School District 73, which is in Kamloops area, as well as the Kamloops Aboriginal Friendship Society. And Bernice has some very interesting information for us this evening. Please welcome Bernice.
Okay. So White Tip in Samastinens Quest, Bernice Jensen. What I said was in Secwepemc. I said, hello, everyone. My name is Bernice Jensen. I am the Cultural Education Coordinator for SD 73, and I'm very honored to be here tonight. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to be sharing with everyone, and we can get that PowerPoint set up. We're ready to go. So you'll see, I'm going to first of all go from the very beginning, and we're going to talk about traditional Secwepemc fishing, harvesting, cooking, storing methods. So we can go to the next slide. If you didn't notice in that previous slide, we'll go back that one, we'll practice that. So with the previous slide, if you ever come to the Kamloops area, it's an actual landmark. So that is that rock formation that you saw on the previous slide. That one is called Coyote Rock. There's a legend with it. There's a story on how it got to be on top of the rock formation there. And that's a lovely story that I learned a long time ago. So Coyote Rock, just between Kamloops and Savannah. So here we're going to talk about the fishing methods from a long time ago, how the fish were caught, the harvesting methods, the salmon ceremony, fishing techniques, cooking methods, and storing techniques. The one thing in this photo you can see, this is a well-known artist in the Secwepemc Hulu. He was a Secwepemc man. His name is Dave Seymour. He has passed away, but his beautiful artwork lives on. That is what they call the birch bark canoe, is called a bullnose canoe. So we can go to the next slide. So we are very fortunate in BC to have so many rivers and lakes. We have a lot of the major rivers being the Thompson River, the North Thompson River, the South Thompson, Clearwater, Barrier, Little Shuswap River, Scotch Creek. There's so many rivers. And then as well as the rivers, we have a lot of lakes. Kamloops Lake, Little Shuswap Lake, Heffley Lake, Dunn Lake, East Barrier. We have, Okanagan Lake. I had mentioned, in the chat, maybe write down a couple of the rivers and lakes in your areas if you would like to share that with some of the other people in the group. So we are very fortunate that there's so many lakes and rivers, and because of the lakes and rivers, we know that we have fish in that territory. So we'll go to the next slide. So one of the major ones that we have, looking at the picture, you can see that this is in the Lytton area, where the blue colored river, as it merges into the Fraser is the murky gray colored, brown colored river. And I chose this photo because you can really see the difference between the two rivers. And this is the Thompson River that's blue as it merges into the Fraser, and then it becomes the Fraser as well. So the Thompson River is one of the major tributaries. It's one of the major rivers for the Fraser River, supplying all of the water that goes to the Pacific Ocean. With the water comes all of the millions of spawning sockeye salmon, Chinook, coho, and pink salmon that travel up and down these water highways to their spawning beds. And the Thompson River is, like I said, the major tributary. So this is in the Lillooet area, which is part of the Statlium Nation. Okay, next slide. Here in Kamloops, we have the North Thompson River. Its water flows from the Rocky Mountains, and it's a beautiful green-blue colored river as it's further north. And then as it comes down, it becomes kind of like a gray colored river. Some of the waters are so wild that they have raft river expeditions on them, and then it calms down again. So you get a lot of salmon like the Chinook salmon. Then you also get Dolly Varden and even the rainbow trout and other trout. And fishermen like to fish on this river as well. This photo here was taken just outside of Barrier. There was a huge forest fire there 5 years ago, I believe. And you can see that in the background and even in the front that there's some trees that were burnt. And I took a picture of that because it's kind of like a landmark now. Okay, next slide. So then we get the South Thompson River that flows west, and it starts from Shuswap Lake. Then you get the Little Shuswap River, and then you get Little Shuswap Lake, and then it goes to the South Thompson River. And this is an important area because, as everyone is aware, we get the major Adams River sockeye run that happens every year. And every 4 years is the big run that everyone talks about because we get, of all the years, the 4th year is the biggest run. And I do believe Molly was telling me next year is going to be the 4-year run again. So that's the time that they'll have displays set up at the Adams River Salmon, or the Adams River Salmon Society will have a bunch of
in Tutuak Park. You're right.
Yes. So it is going to be an amazing time because as a young person myself, I remember traveling to the Adams River to view all of the sockeye in that area. So if you ever get a chance to come to Kamloops and to Chase and go to see the spawning sockeye there, it's amazing. So here, the waters are a lot slower, and in that South Thompson River is very short. It only goes from Chase to Kamloops. In the background in the photo, you can see 2 of the rivers meeting in Kamloops. We have the North Thompson on the left, the South Thompson on the right. In the background, you see 2 little hills, one behind the other, and that is the Mount Paul and Mount Peter, which are landmarks for Kamloops as well. So we have many major fish in this area region. And I know that I was chatting with Mike, and he was telling me that in other areas that some of you may be watching from different locations in British Columbia. What is the fish that you have in your area? Because we're going to talk about fish today. So we're going to talk about the sockeye, the rainbow, the Dolly Varden, the mountain white fish that are found in these areas. So if you can think of a few fish that are maybe not talked about in this presentation, write them down, and I'd love to read them and see what type of fish is in your area as well. So we'll go to the next slide. So talking about some of the local fish harvested, we have the Dolly Varden. what I found really interesting about the Dolly Varden is the fact that they can live up to 16 years. It's amazing. I did not know when I started to learn about the fish, even the white fish, they can live up to 16 years to 23 years. You know, it's a very long time. So those are the things that, and with the whitefish, they have no teeth. So because they have no teeth, they're called bottom dwellers. And so they will eat things at the bottom of the lakes and the rivers. The rainbow trout has teeth on them, and they're quite remarkable because in the second photo coming down from the top to the second photo there, that one is a rainbow. I don't have any pointers. I'm pointing with my finger, but you guys can't see that. So there we go. Someone's got a mouse there. So that is the rainbow, and you can tell by the black spots. They can average about 8 pounds, but they can get up to 4 feet long and 53 pounds. So when I go into the kindergarten classes, I always tell them, I said, who's your smallest child? And I get them to stand up and I show them. Some of these fish are even bigger than our smallest child in the classroom. So it's amazing. We have also the sucker fish, which have many bones and they're poor eating. There's a beautiful legend about sucker fish and how he ended up with so many bones and his type of fish netting around him. So there's a story about that. And he is also a bottom feeder because he has no teeth as well. Now the middle photo, they've got this one here, if you want to use the mouse on that or the cursor on there again. Those ones are called burbot. Those are freshwater cod. We have in the interior, they're found in the lakes and the rivers. They, for First Nations people, they fish for them usually when they spawn, and then when they spawn, they usually are from January to March. So my husband and my family and I, we fish for the rainbow trout, we fish for the burbot, and we love to go out and harvest for sustenance, which means for our family's food. So the burbot, they've got really slimy. If you ever catch one, they're very slimy. They've got little whiskers, and their mouths don't go like a rainbow trout. Their mouths are like this, their faces are this way, whereas the burbot, they're flat and they're this way. So it's really, they're very old fish, I'm told as well. But even older than the burbot, in the fourth slide, you can see about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 men holding this sturgeon. And this sturgeon, I was told when I was reading and doing my PowerPoint, I was told that it was caught in the Thompson River. So the Thompson River, again, comes from Kamloops Lake, Thompson River, Kamloops Lake, then it goes to the Thompson River, then it becomes Savannah. Right in Savannah, you get the Kamloops Lake, Savannah, and then it goes to the Thompson again. Or no, it's Kamloops to the Thompson River to Kamloops Lake, and then it goes by Savannah, it turns into the Thompson River again. But they've got this, these sport fishermen went out and they caught the sturgeon, and there's like 7 people holding that sturgeon up. Now, what I found really remarkable about this was they can get up to about 24 feet, and they can get up to 1,500 pounds, or even up to, and I'm told that they are an endangered species. People used to harvest them for their fish eggs, which was also known as caviar. And some of these sturgeon can live up to 100 years old. The females will live longer than the males. And so because they're endangered, no one is allowed to go fishing for them. If they catch them, they have to do a release. Then we have the steelhead, which is another one in our area, but the one that everyone knows about for in our area is the sockeye. So we have the sockeye, the pink, the chinook, the coho, and the chum. And what everyone knows about is that any of the salmon will will spawn every 4 years. Now I did miss one because it's the kokanee, and the kokanee used to be a salmon at one time, but because of blockages in the rivers when they were trying to make their way to the ocean, they couldn't go to the ocean to spawn, so they spawned in the creeks. And eventually over time, the kokanee didn't have that need to travel all the way to the ocean any longer, and they're considered landlocked sockeye. They're smaller than the regular sockeye, but if you look at them, the two look exactly the same in the color and the red bodies and the green heads, but the kokanee are a lot smaller, whereas I would say like the sockeye, some of the sockeye and other salmon that go to the ocean, they come back and they're really big, whereas the kokanee, they'll be a lot smaller. So we can go to the next slide. So traditional fishing techniques, there are many techniques that were practiced, trial and error, and perfected and passed on from generation to generation among the Secwepemc people and a lot of the indigenous people right across North America. This photo shows a place in the United States called Kettle Falls. And why I chose this one is you can see all the people sitting on the edge of the riverbanks, and you can see there's a platform built over the river, and over the river, that is where the fisherman is using a dip net. It was a very dangerous way of catching fish, but sometimes it was necessary to get out further into the river so that they would miss the bigger rocks that were just underneath the water surface. And so they would use their dip nets with the long poles, and they would reach out and they would feel for the fish once they would hit the nets, and they would know it was time to bring it in. So we'll talk more about the dip nets. So next slide. So on the wall in the photo, you see there's the dip net, the top one. We have the second one from the top is the 3-prong spear, and the other two below it is the single prong and the harpoon. So they were made of wood and with antler or with stone attached to it, so if it was a spear. And it was the easiest form of being able to go fishing. The boys would go out there and go fishing and practice with the men on the riverbanks. And so the single prong and the harpoon were both the easiest method and fastest way to go fishing if you didn't have your fishing, if you didn't have the fishing equipment that you would need. You could make one really simply by just sharpening an edge of your stick and then using it as a spear. So you would sharpen it, and then when it came time, you would be able to go use it to harpoon any of the fish in the river, the creeks. I wouldn't say the river because the river was more higher volume of water, but in the shallower creeks, it would probably be a good instrument to use. Piece of equipment. So next slide. So here, like I said, they would go on. In the first photo, I chose this one because you can see there's a person on the riverbank fishing with the long poles, and they could be the spears that I was talking about, spear fishing from land or horseback. And in the photo, you can see the horse in the background as well. Then we have in the next photo below, we have the 3-prong spear. And if you're to count it, you have 1, 2, 3 prongs on it. And what the three prongs do, and I'm just going to go grab one because I have one here with me.
If you have questions for Bernice, you can put in the chat or you can save for the end too.
Yep. So this is a three-prong spear. And so we have, like I said, 1, 2, 3. And what happens when they go fishing, they would hold it, and then once they seen this fish, they would push down. Now this would have another pole attached to it that detaches, and then you get a string. So once you hit the sockeye or the trout or whatever you were fishing for, once you got the fish in the three prong, what happens is these two prongs here, this part here goes into the spine of the fish, and it actually they tried to paralyze the fish because then it won't struggle too much, and these two parts will capture them into the device. And just remember, when they did fish, it was for food. It wasn't for sport fishing. It was to feed their families. So they would feed their families because a long time ago, there was no stores. There was no grocery stores or anything like that. Everything came from the land. So all the fish that they harvested was put to good use, and they only took what they needed. So this one was the three-pronged spear, and they would use that, and it would capture the salmon inside. And these two would keep it so that it was, once it pushed in, it was hard to pull it out again. And so it would capture it in there. This part here has a second pole that would detach, and there would be a string so that this would be with the salmon or the fish, and then they would use the string to pull this part in by itself. So that one is a three-pronged spear that I have. So the other thing that they needed to remember too was the water's refraction. So when you're looking at something in the water, it might look like it's right there in front of you, but you have to remember that the light bends in the water. So the fishermen had to remember that you would have to go either a little bit below. So if you think that the fish is right here, you would have to go aim just below, because of the refraction, the fish, and you'll notice that some of you older students and kids would notice that when you're in the water, sometimes you think you're looking at, let's say you see a quarter in the water, maybe in the shallow part of the water, and then you try to pick it up right where you think it is, but it's not there because the water bends in the light bends in the water, and you have to go a couple of inches away from it. So that is just the refraction. So that's it for this slide. So we have the dip net, and I'm going to show you a nice little quick activity after this. We'll keep track of the time. And the dip net is made from it's called lodgepole pine. You find it up in the higher parts of the mountains and higher elevations where the poles are really skinny. They're only like about this big, but they're super long. And so they like those poles because they would be easy to handle. They're not heavy, and they would make these dip nets from them. And they would harvest these plants called dogbane or stinging nettle, and they would make these nettings for the dip nets or for the gill nets. So those are different ways that they would make these nettings. Now, when they would put them, again in the photo, you can see there's a platform over the water. And what you have to do is, if the water is going downriver, you would have to paddle your dip net so that the net would stay behind, and you would have to paddle it so that the net would stay open. If you didn't paddle with the current, your net would go downriver. The fish, especially the sockeye salmon and any of the salmon species, would feel the net. So here's your netting. If you didn't paddle, and I'm trying to really be creative here, if you didn't paddle to keep your net open, it would eventually go downstream and your net would be this way. And if the fish felt that, they would just swim away. So you always kept it this way where the hole was. And then once the fish went into the hole, you'd feel a bump on your dip net, and that's when you pull it out. So there was two ways. You could either do the paddling method, but if there were any back eddies, which means the water actually hits a rock downriver, and then the water actually goes upriver. And so the fish will take the back eddy just to take a break, because they travel so far from for instance, Vancouver through the Fraser. They travel so far to swim to their spawning beds that they get tired, that they try to take the easiest route. So they might take a back eddy along the riverbank. They will stop in the lakes to take a break as well. So for the Adams River salmon, they'll take a break at the Kamloops Lake. They'll take a break at the Little Shuswap Lake. They might even take a break at the Shuswap Lake as well before they actually go up to their spawning beds. So that one is the dip net. So we'll go on to the next slide. Pit lamp night fishing is illegal, but a long time ago, like I said, First Nations people did a lot of the fishing for their own food use and to feed their families. Like I said, this is a well-known photo from the artist Dave Seymour from the Kamloops First Nations band. And that is a bullnose canoe. The young children, the young boys, they would go with the men, and their job was to hold the light. And the light attracts the fish at night. They'll swim to the top of the water to see why there's a light there. They're very curious, and they'll swim to the light, and the fishermen on the canoe will be ready with their 3-pronged spears or their spears, and they would harvest the fish that way as well, right from their canoes. So that one, again, you have to remember the refraction of the light, and then you aim just below. So that is a pit lamp night fishing. Okay, next slide. Gill nets. Again, they go from one side of they start on the edge of the riverbank, and they put a net across. And what they would do is they would use they'd build some rocks to tie around at the netting at the bottom of the net to keep it straight. And they would have things like floaters on the top, wood, to keep the net up above the ground, up above the water at the top. And then the fish, as you can see in the diagram, the fish have the gills, and the gills would go through the net because their heads are smaller. And then from there, their bodies get wider. So their head's smaller, then it gets wider. And as they try to go through the net, they get stuck there, and their gills get caught in the gill net. And that's why we call it a gill net. Some of the nets are called drift nets as well, because they don't have to be right on the shore of the river. They can actually float around on the water, but they still keep it stretched out. So I use the gill net method myself, like with my husband and I, when we go to the Fraser River and we've gone fishing for sockeye salmon, we will use the gill net, and then we clean the nets out, and the nets go back out again. So that one is the gill net. So these are fish weirs, and this is local here in the Kamloops in the Chase area where you can see they build these fish weirs that are small posts that are built together. These small posts are side by side, and they would have to be small enough so that the sockeye cannot go through. So they put all these posts together, and they have an opening in the fence, like the fish weir, and there's an opening, and the fishermen would be ready on the side waiting, and they would have their dip nets or their gill nets or their spears or their dip nets, and they would harvest the fish at that time. A lot of the First Nations people, they would harvest whenever the fish were spawning, because that's the time that you would get the most plentiful amount of fish. So with the sockeye run, that's when the fish come in. One of the elders told us that a long, long time ago, before the commercial fishing and before people, like before a whole bunch of the commercial fishing happened, they said they would look over the Fraser River, and when the sockeye were coming up to spawn, you get a gush of the water, as sometimes you get these currents in the water, and you would just see the black of all those salmon that were making their way to their spawning grounds. I've seen it a couple of times in the Lillooet area at Bridge Lake. There's an area right off of Bridge Lake on the Fraser, and it's so turbulent in the water that you could see the fish's fins and their top parts of their bodies. It was pretty exciting to see that. So here they would have their fish weirs. They would use willow, any of the poles that they could, and then they would wait. And then once the fish start trying to go through, they would harvest them that way. So that is the fish weirs. And next slide. So now we have
there's one question about, someone asked if when you make the net with the dog bane, and just curious how long might that last, you know?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So with the dog bane, it's whenever a fisherman made these products, it takes a long time to make, because you have to harvest the dog bane. The dog bane is about maybe only 4 feet long. So 4 feet long, and you need hundreds of feet of the dog bane that has to be spliced together as you're weaving it. And once you do that, then you would make the netting, a lot like how this is the netting. And see how you get the little triangles, oh, right there. See how you get the little triangles in there? They would have to make the gill nets or the dip nets with the triangles as well. And when they made them, you can keep them for a few years. Probably, I know a friend of mine made some, and they go and they use it, but they don't use it all the time. They use it for ceremonial purposes, like when the first salmon come in, they'll harvest the first one and they have a feast. So they don't use it all the time, but if you're a fisherman and you made one of these dip nets or gill nets, they put it away right away. They don't leave it lying around in the elements, so it doesn't get snowed on, it doesn't get rained on. They would put it somewhere where the netting can be dried, and then it would be protected from the rain and the snow. And so they could last for a few years. I'd say about, I'm gonna guess, possibly around, because it's a natural fiber. It's a lot like hemp. It's called the dogwood hemp. And so it's twined together with probably 100 or more fibers of the dogbane hemp. And so each fiber, it takes a long time for it to decompose, as long as you're taking care of it. And so I would guess possibly about 5 years or more. So don't know for sure, but I'm going to say about 5 years, because they never left their items, their fishing equipment lying around, because it takes so long to make. They would have to really take good care of it. So we have the fish weirs here. Thank you, Molly. So we have the fish weirs, basket weirs. What it is it's going from a bigger piece and it's funneling down. Now, I made a beautiful fish weir for the Adams River Salmon Society. And what it does is it has, this one goes from a big piece to a small piece. What I did was and I wish I had a photo of it. I could have, you know, if I was thinking, but it went from a bigger piece, and then there was a little hat on the inside, which was a smaller piece, and it narrows. So the big piece tapers and gets smaller. And then you have a smaller piece that goes in where the circle is smaller, big enough for a sockeye to come in, but then that gets smaller, and they go through the smaller part of the middle section, and then they would get trapped in the fish weir, basket weir. So they had different styles of the fish weir baskets. They didn't have to have any bait or anything. The fish just currently, they would swim upstream. You'd put it in there, organize it so that they would be inclined to swim into the basket. And once they got into the basket, they typically didn't try to swim around to go downstream again, because they're programmed to want to swim upstream. They don't like to really swim downstream too often. So they would sit there, and a lot of the times I was told that they would just sit in the basket after they were trapped, and they just wait until the person comes along and cleans out the baskets. So that one.
We got a question, a private question sent to us. Why were the traps made of willow? Is there a specific reason that was used, or is it just that's plentiful in the river?
Such good questions. Willow is the most flexible of all the shrubs. And so the red willow, the white willow, or the yellow willow, they're very flexible. And when I was making my own fish weir, you need to really weave it in and out of those ribs, and then you weave it in and out. And so it's just like weavings for those that do any kind of like weaving of any sort. You've got to go through the different kind of ribs. And so they have to be very flexible. And if you had any of the other bigger wood, and willow is very skinny, you can get really tiny pieces of willow, and that willow would be good to do the weaving. You can't weave the willow when it's dry, because then it gets hard and brittle. When you're going to do the fish weir baskets, you have to do it when they're freshly harvested, and then they're very flexible as well. So that was the fish weir basket, and it's just to trap them in the device, and then you clean out the basket afterwards, and then you can reset it again. Okay, so next slide.
Someone was asking what tools you might use to make the basket.
You know, the only thing that I used when I did your basket at your guys' Adams Sockeye Salmon Society was just scissors, or like a knife. I had some like thinning shears, or those hedge clippers, and I cut the red willow all about the same length, and then I just started. I used I would have used like dog bane to tie the ribs together in a hoop. And with the red willow, you create a hoop, put the ribs around it, and then you weave, and you start making it into kind of like a cone shape. So that's what I would do for that one. This here is the hook and the hook and line and the night line. So they could put a hook out at nighttime, and if they baited it, you could catch a fish that way, or else they would just do a hook and line as well during the day. So you would bait them, and then they would attract the fish. And then in the top one here, you can see there's two sections. There's the one section that has the wood. The smaller section is actually a piece of bone that they chiseled and formed into like a little hook as well. So they could either jig it during the daytime, bait it as well, and just put it out there. And then they would just, check their lines to see if they caught anything. So I know that we're kind of time is of the essence. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. I think we only have a couple of more, do we? This is ice fishing. Now, believe it or not, I found this very, very interesting. How do you think, and I'm going to tell you in a minute, but maybe if you type in the chat, how do you think they would get the ice? How would they drill a hole in the ice, or how did they chop a hole in the ice a long, long time ago before they had axes and steel tools? What they did, and what I talked to my elders about, was that they had to heat rocks up. So if they were out on the lake and they were wanting to do ice fishing, they would have a fire, burn the rocks, bring rocks with them, and they would heat the rocks up, put it in the one hole. When it got cold, or let's say it started to lose its heat, they would pull it out again, drop in another hot rock until that rock melted right through. Once they had their hole, then they could do their ice fishing. And like I said, one of the things, you can go fishing for the trout in the winter time, and the Dolly Varden and all the other fish like that. But you can also fish at nighttime, and that's the time that the burbot are the most active. And you could fish for the burbot, which is the, I think they call it also freshwater ling, and they would build the holes and they would do that. So yeah, thank you. Has anyone gone ice fishing? I love ice fishing, and it's such a neat thing to do on the lakes in the middle of the winter time. You see Monty Lake, and just outside of Kamloops, has hundreds of, every winter there's always, like, I would say probably a good 30 people fishing, and probably about 50 people on the lake at one given time. It's amazing sport, that ice fishing. So that is another way that they did it. They would fish for the burbot, because the burbot were spawning from, like we said, the January to March, and they would fish for the burbot. Now, the only thing is, you have to always remember that ice can break, and you have to be safe, and you would never go on the ice unless you're with your parents. So don't try this alone. Always have an adult with you. Okay.
We got another question. How did they move the rocks onto the ice without burning themselves?
Well, they would build the fire on the lake. So they would have the ice. They would have maybe they'd have build a fire. They could heat the rocks up, and then they would move it, and then eventually they might. I never really thought about that, because if you're building a big fire, you're going to get a big hole, right? So I'm not sure if they maybe just built the fire and they heated it, or else they just kept putting the wood in and had a smaller fire. That part I haven't quite learned yet. I just, that one was some research. And, to me, I'm thinking they probably would have had a small fire and maybe just kept filled in the fire with the rocks in the middle. But someone in one of my research, they said they built the fire and then they put the rocks in one by one, and then it would take it out again. So that is a good question. I haven't quite learned. I know we're getting close to the end of our slideshow. This one here is a rock weir, and this one is in Capilano River. In the bottom, you can see in the top one how they've got like a maze happening, and these fishermen are in the in this maze. The fish will automatically want to migrate upstream, and so they would build some of these rock weirs, and they go through there. And during low tide, because this is right on the Capilano River, right beside the Burrard, I think it's Burrard Inlet, the water goes high, the fish go in, the tide starts to go out again, and then you will get some fish in these little fish weirs. So there's a lot that will make it through, but there are some that maybe as they they stuck around too long in the area, and then as the water receded during the low tide, then they would get stuck in these pools, and the fishermen would come in with their nets and go fishing. These rock weirs are thousands of years old. They keep, in this territory, in the Squamish Nation, they did this for thousands and thousands of years. It works for them, and they still do it today. So these are modern day photos. And in the bottom photo, you can see they created a holding pen for the fish that they had caught as well. So those fish are not alive anymore. I'm sure they used a little fish club on them, but you can see that they're sitting there waiting, staying fresh in the water until the fishermen will leave. I went down to Vancouver about a month ago, and I was with my brother who lives in the Squamish Nation, and I got to go to the river and watch them do their fishing, which I always enjoy doing. So that is the rock weirs. Okay, next slide. So salmon ceremony is just a ceremony that they'll have every year. They will have a feast of the first fish that they catch. They have salmon songs and dances. Molly and I have a video that we're going to share. I think, no, that's the coyote one, isn't it? We don't have the salmon one with the song that my son composed. He's got a salmon journey song with the dance to go with it. But what they do is they'll have a salmon feast and ceremony in the Okanagan, where I'm Secwepemc and Okanagan, but in the Okanagan by Okanagan Falls, they just had a salmon ceremony last weekend on Sunday, Saturday and Sunday, and they will sing songs and they will have some dances, and they will have a feast of salmon for the salmon that were caught in the Okanagan Falls area. And everyone has to save their bones. And what they would do is they would gather all the bones and they would put it back into the river, because a long time ago, the First Nations people believed that when you had a feast and you would return something back into the water, then they would come back as the salmon the next year. So it was a belief, but they didn't, nowadays we know that the salmon just go down and spawn, and they'll spawn, lay eggs. The little fry will go into the lakes and eventually make their way to the ocean, and then they have that cycle every year. So, but they still give thanks to the salmon for them giving up their life and for, providing food for the First Nations people for the thousands and thousands of years that they lived off the land. So that's the salmon ceremony. Now there's just a few things, and I'm just going to go quickly through here. The cooking methods, we'll go to the next slide. One method we have is the open fire. You can see the grandmother there. She's got the salmon filleted, and she's got it on a skewer, and she's got it stretched out, and she just sets it beside an open fire and cooks it that way. How many of you have tried that? I know I have as a young person, and I loved it. It was, for some reason, it tasted like the best fish ever. So open fire is one method. So next slide. We have the pit cooking, which they build in the bottom photo there. They build a fire and they heat the rocks up. Then they dig into the earth and they put the rocks down and they layer it with vegetation, and they put the salmon or the meat or the roots and the berries in the hole, and they'll cook it for 2 to 4 hours to up to one full day, 24 hours. So depending on if it was meat, if it's salmon, it would be a little faster, but if it's like moose meat or something like that, they could go for almost a day, because it heats it up and cooks it. Then they excavate the site again and they take out all the food, and then they would have a big feast for everyone. So that's pit cooking. Next slide. Wind dried. I was just, here is my sample of wind dried salmon. This is, you can see the skin on the back. And because it's wind dried, they had to cut. So this would be like what they would call the length. And then this is the width this way. And they would cut into the salmon. And the reason that they cut into the salmon was so that there was more surface area so that it would dry faster. And so you would dry it and you would hang dry it like you see in the photos. And I can't wait to try this because here I had it vacuum sealed and then it went into my freezer. And so there is my wind-dried salmon. And what the Statlium people say in the language, they call it stwan, which is dried salmon. So we have some stwan here, and afterwards I'm gonna have a little snack. And you can make even what they call stwan soup. So then we have the storage food caches where they would dig the food, they would dig a hole into the earth. They would put the food in the baskets and then they would line it with vegetation. They covered again, and then they put rocks on top. And the rocks were there to protect it against animals. And maybe in your chat, you might want to say, what kind of animals would try to dig up these food caches? And there was two purposes for the rocks to be put on the food caches. One, to protect it against the animals. Two, so that you knew where you were going to get your food, because you could forget where the food was and you could be digging a hole here and there and maybe everywhere because you would forget where it was. But with those rocks right on top, you would know exactly where to go. So next slide. So we have that in the language of the Secwepemc people, we would say Kuksjachum, which means thank you all. Again, we have another person on the platforms on the river fishing. And I would like to note there in the background, you see a man in the dark blue shirt. He's got a rope tied around his waist. That is the safety rope, because a long, long time ago, over 200-300 years ago, when the men would go fishing, if they got too many fish or maybe they stumbled, they could fall into the river and they could drown. Nowadays, the fishermen are a lot safer. They use safety ropes around their waists. Even when my husband and I go out, oh, I love that raccoon. My husband and I go fishing on the Fraser, we will use safety lines and make sure that if we were to stumble and fall into the river, they would be able to retrieve us and pull us back to shore. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone. I'm going to quickly, I think we're going to watch a video and then we're ready to do a quick activity that only takes about 2 minutes.
Kuksjam,
Yes.
Bernice, and we had some questions during the time. And
I know, it's so much information, hey?
No, we had a few questions. It was great. Are there any other burning questions out there before we do the video? I'm going to go a little over. Okay.
Park, and we have Bernice about to tell us the story of Coyote and the Great Feast of Salmon. A long, long time ago, in the Secwepemc Hulu, Coyote was out gathering all the salmon because it was fall time and the salmon had returned. He had gone out with his dip net and he was harvesting his salmon. He would catch his salmon and he would bring them back. He would prepare all his salmon and he would hang them up on the drying rack. And he was so proud of himself because he had worked so hard to get all the salmon, and he had an abundance. He had extra salmon, so he wanted to share that with the other animal people in his village. And so he hollered to the animals, "Bear, squirrel, come here. I have something to tell you."
Ooh, what's happening?
Well, Squillex, I have gathered so many fish here today that I want to invite you to a big salmon feast.
Whoa, I'm excited.
And squirrel.
Oh, Eschek, he's pretty excited too. He wants to be in on the feast.
So Eschek and Squillex were invited to the big feast as well as other animals. And they had gone, and Coyote said, "We'll have it when the sun goes down on the west side in the supper time, and come back and we will have a big feast." All that day the animals disappeared. All that day Coyote was so excited. He was running around and he was getting ready for the big feast, and he brushed up against the salmon, and his hair would get caught in the dry racks and with the salmon, and he became angry. "Oh, that dumb salmon, it's getting all over in my hair," and it dropped to the ground. Well, Coyote just went about his business, and the salmon started coming back to life. And there the salmon started to move towards the Adams River and swimming away. And Coyote was hollering, come back, salmon." But the salmon did not come back and kept going towards the river and jumping in to the river. Coyote was so upset. He went back to his camp. And there were no salmon in sight. All the salmon were gone. And the animals came back. Squillex and
Eschek, we're ready to eat. We're hungry.
and there was no salmon.
Oh,
And the animals thought, because Coyote is known to be a trickster, that he was just playing another trick on the animals.
are you tricking us?
And Coyote did not have the great feast.
Oh, we're sad.
So that is the story of Coyote and the Great Salmon Feast. And so with that, you guys can come in a bit. With that, there are always lessons to the storytelling. And one of the lessons from the story is,
respect the food that you harvest.
okay, and another one?
Always respect what you take. Don't take more than you need, and don't waste.
Don't waste. And as you're doing things, do things in a good way. So with that, I would like to say Cook's Jachum.
Cook's jam.
Cook's jam.
Thank you.
It brings back fond memories. So we're going to go quickly into a quick dip net, because I know most of us we're 5 minutes over, but this only takes a couple of minutes. So my family all collects chopsticks for me. And what you do is when you go to the restaurant, you can bring your chopstick home, and when you get home, you can wash them, and they're reusable. I'm all about reusing things. So I have a chopstick. I have an orange bag netting that I get, and I have family that collects that for me as well. And the only thing that you have to really buy is, unless your dad has zip ties, a zip tie and tape. So I get this from the dollar store. It's about $1.50 for 4 of them. And so it's pretty reasonable. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna cut out a piece of netting. So here's my little piece of netting here. You're going to get your tape ready to go. I didn't even open the package yet, so I'm going to open it right now. Take the first color out. First one is green. I'm going to get the tape ready as well. So you just have to get the tape ready to go so that when you're taping it, it's all in one quick way. So we've got 5 after I've started. And this is something that I do in the classrooms as well. So I get enough chopsticks for about 30 kids, 25, whatever the number is. They all get a chopstick. They all get a piece of netting that I cut up. They get one zip tie. What I do is I tell them, and the reason I like the zip tie is it's very flexible. So I'm going to weave right over the top section on this part. And it doesn't have to hit every hole. It just has to go over, and there's my one side. Now I'm going to do this side up here. So I bend it, weave it over that part there. That's 2 sides. Now I'm going to weave it over here, bend it again. Again, now I have only one side left. What you need to remember is the box needs to be on the outside. So don't have it facing, if you go like this, you can see how it's supposed to be on the outside, and the tail's going to go in that way. So the box faces the outside. So then I'm going to just weave it the last couple of times on the 4th corner. I'm going to stretch it out. Now I could have made this net a lot deeper, because there it is. So there's my little mini dip net. And I'm going to remember the box goes on the outside and then the tail goes inside. You can hear it click. There it is. I just give it enough of a tail so that I can tape it to my chopstick. There is my tip net. Now, they have those really nice plastic ones that aren't so fuzzy looking. I like those ones a lot better. And then what I'm going to do is you have the pointy side and then you have the straight side. I'm going to put the netting against the straight side. Get a piece of tape. And then I'm going to tape my dip net. So after I do a presentation like I did tonight, then I usually do an activity with the kids so that they can do their very own dip net. And then you just weave you can just twist tie that, and there it is. There is your little mini dip net. And that's what I do in the schools after I do my presentation, I show them. And you can make this a little bit deeper so that it kind of has a little bit of a drop here. This one doesn't have much right there, but you can kind of see there it is. So that is my little mini dip net activity. You can tape it right to the end if you want, just to make it look a little bit nicer. But that is my little dip net that we share with the kids as an activity that we do as well. So thank you so much. And you know what? Always recycle. So I always think, if I can get anything that's for free, that you think about your recycle box, that you can dig in there and find something that you can use to make these little activities. I'm always thinking of ways to do that. So Cook's Jam, and thank you so much.
Cook's Jam to you, Bernice. And thank you everyone for joining us. I think we all learned a whole bunch, and we'll probably still be thinking about all the information. It's been amazing. And I hope you enjoy the fishing season and look forward to seeing you again. And thank you everybody, and have a great Fraser Riverfrest week.
Yes, thank you very much. A big thank you to Molly Cooperman, of course, to Bernice Jensen, and to everyone who joined us this evening. So as Molly just said, all week, this week, the Fraser River Discovery Centre will be doing a number of in-person and online educational activities and workshops. All of this will be free. There's no charge. I will be sending out an email probably tomorrow as a little follow-up to everyone who took part in our presentation this evening with a bit more information. But I'm also posting in the chat the link to our website where we have all of the info about our activities, which are running from the 21st to the 28th, so until next Tuesday. So I know we're a little bit over, so I'll wrap things up. So once again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and a huge thank you to Nature Kids BC and to Bernice Jensen for this wonderful presentation.
Okay. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.